All right, along with factoring, sometimes factoring can get a little bit more difficult than what we're hoping for, and that's why we'll have other ways to solve quadratic equations. But one great thing to do with factoring, if it does become a much harder problem, is to use a method called factoring by grouping, or what's called the swing method. That's just another way of organizing it, and I'll show you what the swing method is here in a minute. The reason that this problem gets a little bit harder than a normal, just basic factoring problem is that notice that our front term, our x squared term, does not have a 1 in front of it. Normally, if that's a 1, all we need to worry about is what multiplies to x squared, which is typically x and x, what multiplies to a negative 3 in the back, and then what adds to the middle. The problem is, if we're multiplying to the front term, remember we could multiply with a 1 and a 4 or a 2 and a 2. And if that's a negative 3 and a positive 1 in the back, or a positive 3 and a negative 1 in the back, there's lots of ways to organize that information. And the other problem becomes that we can't just directly add to negative 4 thinking only about two of the numbers. We need to think about all of our numbers together. So one possibility, again, the longest way of doing it, is to list off all the possibilities, to think about 1x and 4x. Well, I can put a 4x in the front and then 1x in the back. Then I have to worry about, okay, I've got 3 and the 1 that I'm talking about. Do I put a positive 3 with the 4? Do we put the negative 3 with the 4? Or maybe we're supposed to put the 1 over here with the 4, put the 3 over here with the 1x. And how do we organize that information and make it work? The only way to check your answers then is to FOIL out 4x times x is a 4x squared, 3 times negative 1 is our negative 3, but now we have to do the outside inside. So 4x times negative 1 would be a negative 4x plus positive 3x, and notice we get a negative x, which is not what we wanted to add to in the middle. So we would need to check each and every one of these possibilities until we found out at the very end here that 2x times 2x is 4x, and 4x squared, that is. Negative 3 times 1 is our negative 3, and 2x times 1 is a 2x. Negative 3 times 2 is a minus 6x, and 2x minus 6x does give us our negative 4x. So we would find out that this is the only working possibility. Well, to save us a little bit of that time, and using kind of the ideas we have before, we can talk about what's called factoring by grouping. The first thing we're going to do in factoring by grouping is still add to the middle. So I'm still going to say what adds to negative 4x, but what's going to multiply to the ends put together. So 4 times negative 3, what's going to multiply to a negative 12? And you can even put the x squared there if you like. Well, once we figure out what two things do that, the rest of it is just some simple algebra. So let's start thinking about possibilities. Multiplying to negative 12, we could have a 12 and a 1. We could have a 6 and a 2. We could have a 4 and a 3. If they're going to multiply to a negative, obviously one of the two needs to be negative. And if they're going to add to a negative, it better be the larger of the two numbers. And if we think about that, well, negative 12 plus 1 is negative 11. Negative 6 plus 2 is negative 4. And it looks like that is going to be our winner. Now here's where the grouping part takes place. We're going to go ahead and take our original statement, keep the 4x squared. I'm going to split the middle. I'm going to split that negative 4x into the two numbers we just found. So a minus 6x and a 2x. And then I'm going to keep my last term again, that negative 3. Now we're going to go ahead and group our first two terms, leaving that plus sign outside. So we can just throw some parentheses in there. That's perfectly legal. What goes into both 4 and 6 is the first factoring I'm going to do. So I can definitely take out a 2. We can also get an x, leaving behind, inside the parentheses, if I divide 4 by 2, that leaves me with a 2 and the other x, and negative 6 divided by 2 is a negative 3. Then we're going to say plus from our plus sign that's in between here. Well, there's nothing that goes into 2 or 3, or and 3, so I'm just going to take out a 1, leaving a set of parentheses here. And since we didn't really factor anything out, that leaves behind 2x minus 3. I'm going to do that there in green, so that you notice that inside both sets of parentheses now, in both the first half of the problem and the second half of the problem, we've got a 2x minus 3, which means I can factor out 2x minus 3, and again leaving behind my 2x from the front here plus 1 from the back there. If you take away what was in the parentheses, divide that away, it leaves you with this 2x, and in the second half it leaves you with the plus 1. And we've just figured out what our two factors are. Note 2x minus 3 and 2x plus 1. Now, the only other twist you could add to this if you wanted to would be if your original statement would have been equal to 0. Remember that each one of these statements would also be equal to 0. And then you'd have to go and solve as well. So we could split to 2x minus 3 could be equal to 0, or 2x plus 1 equals 0. Adding 3 and dividing by 2, you find out that x could be equal to 1.5, or minus 1 divided by 2 could have been equal to negative 0.5. And again, that's just in case it's a solving problem, you just split to solve at the very end. The factoring takes place on its own. Go ahead and take a minute, pause the video now, and see if you can factor the expression at the bottom using some factoring by grouping. All right, you'll notice using grouping, we're going to add to the middle, so add to 17, but multiply to 5 times 14, or 70. And two numbers that do so are 7 and 10. So we split the middle, 17x just became 7x plus 10x. Then I looked at what was in the first two terms. I could take out an x, leaving behind 5x plus 7. What was in the second two terms? Well, 2 goes into both 10 and 14, so I took out a 2. Note plus 2 there, don't forget that plus sign. But again, left with 5x plus 7. So that's one of my two factors. The x plus 2 that we had factored out becomes your other factor. Now, another way to factor that same problem would be using what's called the swing method. And essentially, it's just like factoring by grouping, only it's going to organize our parts in a little bit different way with kind of this little alien or face-looking symbol down here with those parentheses in the middle. So it's called the swing method. You're still going to begin by saying what's going to multiply to 5 times 14. We still need to figure out what's going to multiply to the ends, right? So multiply to those ends. So we need to figure out what multiplies to 70, but adds to the middle. So adds to 17. And again, the two numbers that we found before were 7 and 10. And this works for any grouping problem. In fact, any factoring problem. If you can find those two numbers, you find those parts, now you're off and running. Now the difference is I'm not going to rewrite the whole statement out this time. I'm going to kind of separate my pieces. 5x squared is what you're going to get from the first part of FOIL. Think about that being FOIL there. Then we're going to split our middle again. Our 17x is going to become our 7x and our 10x, and we're going to write those down here. Those are your outside and inside. So that was O and I. And then your last comes from your 14. So that's where we get our FOIL there. Once you've got FOIL written out, or you've got those pieces kind of doing a backwards FOIL here, now we're ready to do some basic factoring. What we want to know is for this first term, what's going to go in that front part, what goes into both 5x squared, which would touch that part, and 10x, which notice the line touches that part. And since 5x goes into both of those, we're started. Now we just follow the lines. What times 5x would give us 5x squared? Well, if we follow the blue line, we know that x would. Also, you could go down below instead if you wanted to. What times 5x would have given you 10x? And if we follow that line, we know that 2 times 5 could have given us 10x. If we follow our last line here, notice we had found this x in the middle here. So x times what gives you 7x? Well, we need a 7 over here. 7 times x would have been our 7x. And notice that 2 times 7 gives us that 14. And since we didn't need any negatives, again, we can just put in those positive 7 and positive 2. And you figure out that 5x plus 7 times x plus 2 is our factored form. And again, the final thing to remember is if our original statement would have been equal to 0, then our middle statement would, this statement would, and then we would want to split to 5x plus 7 equals 0, x plus 2 equals 0, and actually go solve, subtracting 7 and dividing by 5. and subtracting 2 in the other equation, and you would have found your 2 answers. Again, the swing method is just another way to look at grouping. Hopefully one of those 2 methods will work for you. Hopefully you'll have a great day, and good luck factoring.